Harold S. Kushner, best-selling author and rabbi emeritus at the Temple Israel in Natick, Massachusetts, describes the significance of man's search for meaning and the book's emphasis on man's will to survive. Through the experience of Frankl in the camps during the Nazi occupation, he realizes that apart from understanding the suffering of the victims during this period, it is also relevant to ask the question of why and how the survivors managed to hang on to life. Pondering on this, Frankl realizes that the key to survival is treating life as a quest for meaning. A person can endure anything that life throws at him if he understands that he has the freedom to choose what to feel about each situation he faces, no matter how strongly he is opposed by outside forces that he cannot control. Fittingly, Kushner's experience as a clergyman allows him to relate to these insights. He has seen hopelessness and depression among the members of his congregation, so he naturally agrees with Frankl's notion that dictates having a why to live, but this enables man to endure the how. Frankl writes about how he sees the book's success as a reflection of society's ongoing search for the meaning of life. Rather than celebrate this accomplishment, he points this out as an opportunity for contemplation. He shares how he intended to publish anonymously, that he only planned to identify himself by his number, 119104, that his writing was for the sole purpose of conveying his experiences and realizations to the reader. He did not expect the book to gain as much success as it did, but with this, he came to understand that success cannot be pursued by force. It is only through one's dedication that success can and should happen naturally. Frankl writes that he could have gotten out of Austria in time to escape the horrors of the concentration camp, that he could have used opportunities in America to write about his brainchild, Logotherapy. Yet he chose to stay, because he couldn't leave his aging parents to their ill fate. He knew then that his first duty was to be a responsible child to his mother and father. Experiences in a concentration camp. Unlike most history books, this work is based not on the great horrors of the concentration camps, but on the personal experiences within them, detailed in the attempt to satisfy the question of how these events had been reflected in the mind of the ordinary prisoner. These stories reflect the situation in the smaller concentration camps where the real extermination took place, giving a voice to the great multitude of unknown victims. These were the common prisoners who suffered the most under the camp guards and wardens. Contrary to the popular belief about life in the camps, each day wasn't just filled with pitiful images. It was a constant fight for existence. Frankl shares how capos, prisoners with special privileges entrusted by the SS, could easily turn against their fellows and treat them even more brutally than the soldiers would. He has witnessed how, during the selection of prisoners to be sent to the gas chamber, each one would let another number take the fall in order to save his own skin. Frankl admits that the best of them were those who did not return. The accounts herein contain very intimate experiences, and the contents of this book can contribute to the psychology of prison life. For those who are themselves survivors from the camps, this book will present their experiences in the present-day perspective. For those who were fortunate enough to have avoided the experience completely, this work will help them understand the experiences of the inmates. In studying the collected materials on prisoners' experiences, it becomes clear that there are 3 phases of an inmate's mental reactions to life in the camps. The first one comes after admission, the second when he is well entrenched in the camp routine, and the third phase follows upon release. The primary symptom that characterizes the first phase is shock, which was made apparent by Frankl's own experience. He arrived by train in Auschwitz to see some prisoners who seemed well treated, leading him to believe that his own situation could not be as horrible as he thought it would be. Frankl calls this the delusion of reprieve, a psychiatric condition that afflicts the condemned man, leading him to assume that he will gain salvation at the very last minute. All the prisoners clung to this last shred of hope, not knowing that prisoners who welcomed them were a selected elite. Capos, prisoners who were entrusted by the SS to work for them against their fellow captives in exchange for special privileges. A prisoner's fate was decided upon entering the camp. Those who appeared sickly or incapable of work were immediately sent to the gas chambers, while the rest were segregated into a different queue. About 90% of those who were with Frankl in transport had already been sentenced to death by this method alone. The SS seemed charming at first, but Frankl realized this was to persuade them to hand over their valuables without a fight. Some prisoners had not grasped just how much would be taken away from them, that they would be left with nothing but a naked existence. Again, the delusion of reprieve. Frankl found himself adopting a cloak of curiosity, believing that he was anxious to see what would happen next to protect himself from the dreaded reality. 1,500 captives were kept in a shed meant for 200, and they had to suffer through dire conditions of a scale which they had never seen before. Frankl realized just how much a man could endure, that a man could really get used to anything, as Dostoevsky states. Although the thoughts of hopelessness, depression, and suicide had entered the minds of some, he pledged that he would never run into the wire. The shock of admission had not burdened him as greatly as some of the others. As a psychiatrist, Frankl understands that an abnormal situation naturally triggers an abnormal reaction. This was evident as the prisoners passed from the first phase to the second stage of psychological reaction, relative apathy or emotional death. Apart from the physical torments they went through, there was a feeling of homesickness and disgust with all the filth that surrounded them, physical or otherwise. These were just some of the painful emotions they tried to numb, especially when unwarranted reactions were dealt with by punishment. Eventually, a prisoner was able to withstand the sight of his fellow captive being tortured. Frankl knows this all too well, especially when he witnessed one death after another on his duty attending to typhus patients, while the others scavenged what little items they could from the still warm bodies. This second stage, the blunting of emotions, was particularly necessary, as it serves as a protective shell against the emotional turmoil that comes with the frequent beatings. Frankl shares how he and others had been beaten for the smallest of infractions, and sometimes for no reason at all. What hurt the most was not the physical trauma, but the unfairness of it all. When he could not bear the insult, he began to show indignation and was past caring about what they would do to him for it. What saved his life in this encounter was the favor of a particular capo whom he had listened to and provided with psychotherapeutic advice. This apathy was a necessary form of self-defense. Instead of dwelling on pains endured, a prisoner would more likely sigh with relief at the end of the day, grateful to have preserved his own life for as long as he had managed to do. A captive was diminished to his most primitive level, a psychological regression of sorts, in which his desires were reduced to the simplest of things manifested in dreams of wish fulfillment. The situation of the camps was so horrible that, as Frankl said, he would not wake a man suffering from a nightmare, knowing that any dream would have been better than their reality. The desire for food was the major manifestation of this psychological regression to primitive instincts, a result of the severe undernourishment that the prisoners suffered. One had to adopt methods of rationing the small bread portions throughout the day. They would gather in groups when they were not being closely watched and discuss food, recipes, their favorite dishes, and what they would serve on their family reunions once they were liberated. Frankl considers this temporary psychological relief as dangerous and unhelpful to a prisoner's adaptation to his extremely deprived circumstances. Extreme undernourishment had prompted a complete disregard for anything that didn't concern basic survival. What followed was a complete absence of sexual urges, a total lack of sentiment, and a cultural hibernation, with the exception of politics and religion. The religious interests of some prisoners had evolved in depth and vigor. Prayers were improvised, and religious services were held in secrecy. Frankl observed that this deepening of spirituality was surprisingly possible amidst the primitiveness, especially with those of a more delicate constitution, intellectuals, who had greatly suffered physically but had kept their inner selves more intact than those of a robust nature. To Frankl, this intensification of inner life came in the form of a memory of his wife. One early morning, as he was marching, a fellow captive approached him to express how he hoped their wives were in a better state than they were. Frankl was transfixed by the thought as he clung to his wife's image. Then he saw the truth timelessly sung by poets, the wisdom that man's salvation is attained through love and in love. He understood that a man who had nothing left in the world could experience bliss in the thought of his beloved. He had mental conversations with his wife, and later on realized that even if he had known she was dead at the time, he would still have found respite in these meditations. The development of this inner life helped the prisoners find refuge from all the other poverties of their existence. It was an escape into the better life of the past. In Frankl's mind, he was performing the most mundane tasks. Details of him unlocking his front door or answering his phone. He beheld the beauty of nature with a more mystified awe as he viewed the mountains of Salzburg on the way to a Bavarian camp. One evening, a fellow prisoner beckoned for everyone to run out and see a magnificent sunset. They were moved by its beauty, all of them in silent reverence. Aside from approaching nature, there was art. One might wonder what forms of art could possibly exist in a concentration camp. It all depends what one considers to be art. For the prisoners, it was the improvised entertainment programs that they would hold from time to time. These gatherings were filled with song, poetry, and even satirical jokes about the camp. It helped them forget so much that some even afforded to miss their daily food rations just to attend. Generally speaking, any artistic impression to be found in such circumstances was only possible through seeing its contrast to camp life. It was the same with humor too, another weapon in the fight for survival. Frankl had succeeded in this aspect by exchanging amusing stories with a fellow captive. They would tell each other about imagined incidents of their lives after liberation. These things, among other trivial matters, had become their greatest joys. For instance, when Frankl and the others were taken to Dachau, they rejoiced in its lack of an oven or chimney, pertaining to the gas chambers and crematorium. When they arrived, they were made to stand outside all through the night, frozen and soaked, but they were still very pleased, for unlike Auschwitz, in Dachau, their deaths were not as certain. The definition of luck had changed too. Any captive who got to work in a sheltered factory, or anyone who didn't have to wade in the muddy railways, were the lucky ones, as well as those who weren't grouped under the more brutal foremen, or those who could take regular baths and use mattresses. Even days spent in the sick quarters provided some comfort. They didn't have to work. They would lie in bed all day, waiting for the daily bread rations. These small mercies provided a negative happiness, or freedom from suffering, as posed by Schopenhauer. It was very rare, almost impossible, to find real positive pleasures. These were not the only losses suffered in the camps. The undignified and inhumane treatment led one to lose his values as an individual. Prisoners became part of a mass of people and nothing more, as if from a horde of animals without a will of their own. They were driven as a herd, like sheep, who could only think of evading the vicious dogs and scraping for food. One had to blend in to avoid attracting special attention from the SS, or position himself at the center of the crowd to gain a little bit of warmth from the cool wind. Nevertheless, there would always be a craving for privacy and solitude every once in a while. Frankl considered himself lucky enough to have found 5-minute intervals of solitude whenever he wasn't needed to make his rounds among the sick. At the time, he himself had been suffering from a serious case of typhus. To him, it was better to die serving the greater purpose of helping his comrades rather than perish as the unproductive laborer that he was. No medicine was given to those who were desperately ill. Any type of aid was reserved for patients who still had a chance to recover and be productive in manual labor once more. Frankl, surrounded by corpses, recognized how difficult it would be for an outsider to completely grasp just how much human life was devalued in the camps. A prisoner's value came only in the form of his number. No names, no histories, no documents to prove they had a life before the occupation. Thus, only the bare necessities mattered. Prisoners found themselves unsentimentally scanning over those who were being led to the gas chambers, trying to see whether they had better shoes or coats to be salvaged once they were dead. It didn't matter what they felt. It was only the moods of the camp guards that ruled over their lives. The prisoners were reduced to being their playthings. They were less than human. Completely dependent on the mercy of the guards in Auschwitz, Frankl devised a rule for himself that proved to be useful. He vowed to respond truthfully to any question directed at him, but he wouldn't mention anything that wasn't asked specifically. When asked about his age, he'd give the number. When questioned about his profession, he'd say, "Doctor," sparing all the details. After rigorous selection, grouping and regrouping for transport, he found himself destined for a rest camp. The other prisoners looked at him with pity, thinking that the transport to a rest camp was merely a ruse, and all those were headed to the gas chambers. In truth, those who were left behind would suffer such an extreme case of famine that they had to resort to cannibalism. Frankl got out just in time. It seemed that their lives were in the hands of fate. All camp inmates were tormented by this. They had lost all regard for taking the initiative or making decisions, afraid that they would steer the course of their lives the wrong way. This was true even during instances when a crucial decision could mean life or death. For Frankl, it was when he had the chance to escape. The plan was in motion, but one of his patients looked at him with hopelessness and knew that he was getting out. He felt uneasy about fleeing, and he told his friend he could not go with him after all. As soon as he said this, he felt an inner peace he had never experienced before. He stayed to continue attending to the sick, letting life take its course. As the front lines of the war came nearer, prisoners were moved from one camp to another. Mass evacuations were conducted with haste before the camp was set on fire. They had assumed everyone was destined to leave, but no trucks came to collect the sick. It seemed they were to burn with the camp. Frankl and his friend knew then that they had to completely follow through with their escape. They were to do this while completing the task of burying the dead beyond the wire fence. However, just before they got out, a truck from the International Red Cross in Geneva arrived, promising protection for the prisoners and providing them with medicine. According to the Red Cross delegate, an agreement with the SS had been signed so that the prisoners were to be sent to Switzerland. Photographs were taken, and the inmates were full of joy. Frankl and his friend decided that the escape had been unnecessary, and that it wasn't worth it to risk getting caught in the fighting lines. Later that night, the SS arrived with trucks, and they proceeded to clear the camp. Days passed, and Frankl and his friend waited in anticipation until the battlefront finally reached them. The next morning, the noises of war ceased, and a white flag was hung from the camp gates. Weeks later, Frankl found out that those who were loaded into the trucks supposedly heading for Switzerland were actually locked in huts and burned alive. With such experiences, it is no surprise that camp inmates would shield themselves with apathy as a defense mechanism in this second phase of their mental state. They were overcome with hunger, sleep deprivation, and a general state of irritability. Psychological complexes were inevitable. They had all been infected with an inferiority complex as a result of the degrading treatment they had received. On the other hand, prisoners who had been given special privileges had delusions of grandeur. The less prominent majority experienced their disdain outwardly, sometimes as jokes, and when they came into conflict, these tensions would grow to become explosive fights. The quick tendency towards violence had only come from the fact that they witnessed an immeasurable amount of beatings throughout captivity. Frankl shares that he himself wasn't spared from such temperaments. He had seen it most evidently when he worked as a doctor in the typhus sector, caring for the sickest patients. Frankl was responsible for keeping the huts clean and tidy, the orderliness of which were always upset by the uncooperative patients who were restless and couldn't follow orders unless shouted at. This was how bad the case of apathy got. Frankl had to go through great lengths to control his own irritability and apathy, so he wouldn't end up hitting his fellow inmates out of anger. In this study of the psychological characteristics of concentration camp prisoners, Frankl shows that man is not a mere accidental product of his surroundings. He bases this on experience, seeing that there were times when prisoners had overcome their apathy to show a more heroic nature. Despite the physical and psychological distress, he found that a spiritual freedom can be preserved. There were those who had mustered the strength to give away their bread rations, walking from hut to hut, providing others with comfort despite being in need of it themselves. Although this behavior was seen from a very few number of inmates, it was enough proof that no matter how much is removed from a man, the freedom to choose his attitudes towards his circumstances cannot be taken away from him. The mental reactions of a camp prisoner are more than expressions of his condition. Frankl's final analysis clarifies the transformation of a prisoner was a result of the influences of camp life, and more importantly, his inner decisions. Thus, human dignity may be retained. This is the very spiritual freedom that gives life meaning and purpose. However, the meaning of a life filled with action, creativity, beauty, and joy cannot be complete without suffering. Like fate and death, suffering is a fixed part of it. It is the way in which man accepts his death and suffering that he is given a chance to find a deeper meaning in life. According to Frankl, a man can either find courage and dignity when faced with such testing challenges, or he can be reduced to animalistic impulses. This choice will determine if a man is or isn't worthy of his sufferings. One might think that such concepts are very specific to the victims of concentration camps. Nevertheless, Frankl emphasizes that these considerations are not very far from real life. In any situation where a man is challenged by his fate, he has a chance of achieving something when he overcomes his suffering. For example, there are those with terminal afflictions who wait for death with courage and dignity. In the camps, Frankl had known a woman who knew she would die in a few days' time. Yet she was cheerful as she talked about finding value in her spiritual accomplishments, joyous in the promise of eternal life. There were others, unlike this woman, who had fallen prey to the camp's influences. These were the men who allowed their inner selves to be devoid of morality and spirituality. A new question arises: what makes up this inner hold? Frankl studies this by looking into what forces a prisoner to let go of his inner self. Those who have survived share that it was the uncertainty of the imprisonment duration that did not allow them to see any future or goal in life. This state was called the Provisional Existence of unknown limit, leading to a strange time experience or deformed view of time. The prisoners felt that small units of time, like a few hours or a day, lasted longer than a week. What further intensified the distress of this provisional existence was the limitation of space within the prison. Anything beyond the wired fences seemed unreal and unattainable. The inmates saw themselves as dead men, and everything became pointless, until even the rare chances to improve camp life were overlooked in favor of living in the past. To Frankl, the reality was that his captivity was a challenging opportunity. The majority of the prisoners were resigned to simply vegetate, but others found their inner triumph. Thus, Frankl postulates that in order to aid a prisoner in his fight against the camp's mental influences, he has to be given inner strength through making him realize a future goal he could work for. Frankl shares how he achieved such a realization. At one time, he was preoccupied by the most trivial matters of camp life. Should he trade his cigarette? How would he fix his shoes? What could he do to get into the capo's favor? He became disgusted with his own trifling thoughts and decided to turn his attention elsewhere. Suddenly, he envisioned himself in a pleasant lecture room, giving a lecture about the psychology of a concentration camp prisoner. At that moment, his negative emotions became a thing of the past. He concludes that emotion is suffering, and it ceases to be such only when one forms a clear picture of it in his mind. When a man fails to do this, he loses faith in the future, and is doomed to be subject to mental and physical degeneracy. In the camps, the symptoms of this decay come suddenly. A prisoner starts to refuse getting dressed or going out to march. No threats or punishment have any effect on him. He lies down, immobile. Frankl had realized just how dangerous this state of mind can be. He had a senior block warden who, in a dream, was told that the war and suffering would be over for him by March 30th of 1945. When liberation didn't come on the promised date, he fell seriously ill. He died on the 31st of March. Physical examination would point all signs to typhus, but by exposing the warden's state of mind, Frankl sheds light on a different kind of affliction. The extreme disappointment weakened his body's resistance against the infection. Observations of the increased death rates during Christmas and New Year's 1944 to 1945 further prove this point. Apart from the harsh working conditions, new epidemics, and low food supply in winter, the majority of prisoners who had hoped to come home for the holidays were severely disappointed. A great number of inmates died. As in Nietzsche's words, they did not have a why to live for, so they couldn't bear the how. A fitting motto to guide all psychotherapeutic efforts aimed at prisoners. Man's attitude to life has to change. Frankl emphasizes that instead of asking what one can expect from life, one must ponder on what life expects from him, accompanied by the correct actions. The tasks that need to be fulfilled vary from one person to another, largely depending on someone's specific situation. Therefore, there is no general definition of the meaning of life. When a person must accept the burdens of his fate, he will have to see the opportunity that lies within it. For Frankl and his fellow prisoners, these were the thoughts that kept them from falling into irreparable despair. The poet Rilke speaks of getting through suffering, as if it were the same as getting through work. This was particularly applicable to the prisoners of the camps. They bore their sufferings, sometimes in tears, but Frankl recognizes that there is no shame in weeping. The tears were proof of their courage to suffer. Psychotherapeutic measures in the camps began as life-saving procedures for the prevention of suicides, especially since the inmates were not allowed to save those in the attempt. The focus on the why became relevant, especially when Frankl encountered two men who planned to kill themselves. One man had a child waiting for him, while the other was a scientist who needed to finish his work. Each why was unique, but they were both responsibilities that only these men could have performed. Life expected them to fulfill these roles specifically. If each prisoner had known their respective whys in the same manner, they would have all been able to endure the hows. The right examples have to work hand in hand with the right words. Frankl recalls a particular day when a starving prisoner had stolen some potatoes. The camp authorities ordered them to either expose the thief or starve for a day, and the 2,500 inmates preferred to fast. That evening, the lights went out and everyone was at their worst temperaments. Then, the senior block warden stepped up to encourage the men. He talked about the hopelessness as the real reason for the deaths of their comrades, and he prompted Frankl to give advice. Hungry and tired, he himself was in no condition to provide solid encouragement, but he knew that it was absolutely necessary considering the situation. He began by quoting Nietzsche, saying that what doesn't kill a man makes him stronger, and that all the losses they had suffered thus far could be restored as long as they kept themselves alive. Then he spoke of the endless possibilities that the future might bring, including a stroke of luck. For a prisoner, luck would mean getting reassigned to a group with better working conditions, and Frankl assured them that it was possible. He also talked about the joys of the past, and how these made their present darkness just a little more bearable. He went on to say that life never ceases to have meaning, and that this includes suffering, that anyone important to them would not want to see them give up. Finally, he spoke of the significance of their sacrifice, that they shouldn't die for nothing. Frankl's efforts were successful. Tears welled up in the eyes of his fellow prisoners as they approached to thank him. Frankl now concludes the second phase and introduces the third stage of a prisoner's psychological reactions, the mental state after liberation. He postulates that it is necessary to first consider the psychological state of the camp guards before delving into the details of the third phase. For instance, how could these men have treated the prisoners the way they did? To answer this, one must understand some general points about camp guards. Among them were the clinically sadistic, which were called upon whenever an extreme detachment of guards was necessary. There would always be a designated guard in their ranks who specialized in torture. Most of them had been dulled or hardened by what they had witnessed in the camps. They didn't stop the others from carrying out sadistic measures, but at least they refused to be actively involved. Some had even gone as far as to take pity on the prisoners. In the camp where Frankl was detained, the commander had been known to purchase medicine for the inmates. Ironically, it was their camp warden, a fellow prisoner, who was more brutal than the SS. Thus Frankl concludes that labels like camp guard and prisoner can never be sole indicators of a man's kindness. Lines between groups of people will always be blurred. To discuss the third stage, liberation, Frankl revisits his experience after the white flag had been raised at the camp gates. The once cruel guards had changed into civilian clothes, handing out cigarettes to the inmates. After prolonged tension, the prisoners were in a state of total relaxation, wandering out of the camp with slow and unsure steps. They could not at first grasp the reality of their freedom, to the point that they returned to their huts in the evening, feeling uncomfortable about the day's events. They had lost the capability to feel happiness, and had to reacquaint themselves with it slowly. In psychological terms, this phenomenon is called depersonalization. The prisoners couldn't believe that their liberation was true, especially when they had dreamed of the moment many times before, only to be awoken in the morning by a camp guard's whistle. However, they eased into it slowly, firstly by satisfying the starved body's need for nourishment. They were surprised by how much they could eat. A few days after, Frankl had walked past wide flowering meadows and into the market town. He had become human again, and his new life had started. The transition from mental restraints towards peace of mind is not completely free from obstacles. The suddenness of the change is particularly dangerous for a prisoner's morale and spiritual well-being. They would exercise their newfound liberties to shift from being the victims towards becoming the oppressors, justifying their actions by their horrible experiences. Frankl emphasizes that nobody has the right to do wrong, even when so much wrong has been done to them. But guiding these men into this truth would be a slow process. They weren't bad people. This was simply a result of the sudden release of psychological pressure. Together with this came bitterness and disillusionment upon returning to the old life. A prisoner would return to his hometown only to find out that people had no knowledge of what he'd gone through, that they themselves had suffered. This made the prisoner feel bitter. Disillusionment, on the other hand, came with the prisoner finding out that everyone he had anticipated to reunite with were gone from their lives forever. As a psychiatrist, Frankl found this to be one of the most difficult cases to overcome. He himself had experienced it, losing all his family at the hands of the Nazis. One thing was for certain. For the liberated prisoners, all their horrible experiences in the camps would one day seem to be nothing but a nightmare. And, with the exception of God, they did not have anything else to fear. Logotherapy, in a nutshell. Frankl writes this chapter to satisfy the reader's need for a fuller understanding of his therapeutic doctrine, logotherapy. He found this to be challenging, considering that the entirety of the subject is covered in 20 volumes. He introduces logotherapy in terms of psychoanalysis, where a patient lies down on a couch to express his personal thoughts. In logotherapy, the patient may remain sitting, but he must also be receptive to things he may find hard to hear. The term originates from the Greek word logos, which denotes meaning. Logotherapy has been called the third Viennese school of psychotherapy by some authors. According to this doctrine, man's search for meaning in his life is the primary force that motivates him. It focuses on fulfilling the patient's search for meaning. In other words, it is a meaning-centered psychotherapy. It does not revolve around the formation and feedback mechanism, breaking up a patient's self-centeredness and neurosis. His confrontation with the meaning of life enables him to overcome his worries. The will to meaning. Frankl postulates that man's search for meaning in life does not spring from intellectual drives. This meaning is unique to every man, that he alone may fulfill it, and in doing so he will satisfy his will to meaning. He contradicts others who claim that meanings and values are simply defense mechanisms, that man does not simply die for the sake of his reaction formations. Frankl incorporated statistical surveys for his study of logotherapy. In France, he found that 89% of people believed that man needed a reason or person to live for, and 61% even conceded that there was something or someone they were ready to die for. In another survey involving 7,948 students across 48 colleges, social scientists from the Johns Hopkins University found that 16% of the students considered making a lot of money as the very important concern for them, while 78% responded that their primary goal was to find purpose and meaning to life. Frankl recognizes the possibility that an individual's concern with values is a mask to hide inner conflicts, and he emphasizes the need to unmask these pseudo-values. However, this unmasking will not be necessary once the authenticity in man is revealed. In this case, authenticity is man's desire for a meaningful life. Frankl points out that any psychologist who insists on the unmasking does so only to satisfy his own motive of debasing what is genuine in man. Existential frustration. Logotherapy dictates that when a man's will to meaning is frustrated, this brings about existential frustration. This can also result in neuroses, but rather than the traditional psychogenic sense, this is a neurological neurosis. The term is coined from the Greek word nous, or mind, pertaining to the mind dimension of human existence. Neurogenic neuroses. Although neurogenic neuroses emerge from the frustration of the will to meaning, Frankl also recognizes that there are conflicts and manifestations of a man's suffering that are not necessarily neurotic. This is especially true when the suffering comes from existential frustration. After all, any man who searches for a meaning to his existence is not automatically considered to be suffering from disease. To emphasize his point, Frankl provides an example. A prominent American diplomat had once come to him to continue the psychoanalytic treatment that he had been receiving for 5 years from an analyst in New York. The patient was not happy with his career. All that time his analyst had been telling him that his inner conflicts came from his hatred towards his father, as the images of the US government and his superiors were nothing but father figures. To Frankl, this wasn't a case of neurosis in the traditional sense. This patient didn't need psychotherapy for the very reason that he wasn't actually a patient. This diplomat only suffered from existential frustration due to his vocation. When he did find another profession, he suffered no longer. This shows how some conflict is actually normal, even healthy for a person's well-being. Existential frustration is neither psychological nor is it pathogenic, but merely an existential distress. Existential despair should not be cured by tranquilizing drugs. It is then the doctor's task to guide the patient through the crisis towards growth and awareness of the hidden logos of existence. This is where logotherapy as an analytical process comes in, but it contrasts to psychoanalysis because it deviates from pinning man's conflict merely on drive, instinct, id, ego, and superego. New dynamics. Frankl considers it a dangerous misconception to think that mental health is defined by equilibrium or homeostasis, a state devoid of tension. He sees that mental health actually requires a certain amount of tension, one that is between what a man has achieved and what he is yet to accomplish. He provides his experience in the concentration camps as an example. He had observed that those who knew there was a task awaiting them were the ones most fit to survive. Frankl himself had in mind the goal of finishing his manuscript after the one he possessed, ready for publication, was confiscated in Auschwitz. He had written notes on small pieces of paper in the hopes that it would aid him once he was liberated and could write fully again. This means that one should not be afraid of challenging an individual to find meaning in life to fulfill. Thus, man needs new dynamics, the existential dynamics in a polar field of tension, where one pole is meaning and the other is the man who has to fulfill it. These dynamics may be applied both for normal and neurotic conditions. A therapist may help his patient to achieve mental health by creating a healthy amount of tension through reorientation towards the meaning of life. The existential vacuum. The existential vacuum is the feeling of complete meaningless in life, an inner emptiness or void. This is a widespread phenomenon observed in the 20th century. Frankl traces the cause of this phenomenon to the losses that man has had to suffer, the dependence on basic animal instinct and the loss of traditions that defined his behavior. Modern man now finds that he does not know what he wishes to do, that there is no basic instinct to dictate it, and there is no tradition with which he must comply. Now one either subjects himself to conformism or totalitarianism. Statistical surveys present the matter more concretely. For instance, among Frankl's European students, 25% had shown a degree of existential vacuum, whereas for his American students, it was 60%. The existential vacuum mainly manifests itself in the form of boredom. Surprisingly, boredom, more than distress, brings more problems to solve in the psychiatric perspective. The problem is expected to worsen. especially in the dawn of automation, that will give way to an increase in leisure hours for the average worker. For instance, Sunday neurosis, a form of depression observed in people who have become aware of a void in their lives once the busy week is done. The extreme depression, aggression, or addiction that springs from this cannot be fully understood without the context of the underlying existential vacuum. In addition, masks like the will to power and the will to pleasure, sexual compensation, also appear. Such cases are also evident in psychogenic neurosis. Thus, logotherapy is indicated for psychogenic, somatogenic, and neurogenic cases alike. As Magda B. Arnold justifies, every therapy must be, in some way, logotherapy. The meaning of life. It is only natural that a patient will come to ask what the meaning of life is. And a doctor cannot answer this inquiry in the general sense, because the meaning of life differs from one person to another, as well as between situations. Thus, it is important to define the meaning of life according to a specific moment for the individual. The answer is not abstract. Every task is unique, as well as the opportunity that lies within it. According to Frankl, man must recognize that the question is not outward, but inward. One should not ask the meaning of life as much as he should recognize that the question is directed at him, and he may only respond by answering for his life. In logotherapy, such is the responsibleness that defines the essence of human existence. The essence of existence. The general truth of logotherapy dictates that a man must imagine the present is past, and that the past may be changed or amended. This establishes the finiteness of life, as well as the finality of actions he takes to determine his life. Man is asked to determine for what or whom he is responsible for. The patient then determines his life's task towards society and himself. The logotherapist is merely the eye specialist to the painter or patient. Then, through the self-transcendence of human existence, man discovers the meaning of life, not within his own psyche, but in the world, as if it were a closed system. Frankl postulates that the more one forgets about himself and dedicates his life to another cause, the more he is actualized. Thus, self-actualization is a side effect of self-transcendence. In summary, the meaning of life can be discovered by three ways. 1. The creation of works or deeds. 2. An experience involving something or someone. And 3. One's attitude towards inevitable suffering. Frankl elaborates the second way, experiencing something or someone, and concludes in the context of love. The meaning of love. Frankl states that it is only by loving another human being that we can become fully aware of the other person's very essence. He sees the other person's traits, features, and potential. Through this love, the beloved person gains the ability to actualize his potential. In logotherapy, love is not defined merely by sexual drives and instincts. Rather, sex is the expression of the togetherness of love. The meaning of suffering. The ability to transform personal tragedy into triumph and achievement is uniquely human. Suffering challenges us to change ourselves even when the nature of the suffering is its permanence. Frankl demonstrates this with an example. Once, he was approached by an elderly general practitioner to aid his severe depression. He could not get over the death of his wife. Frankl confronted him with a question. What would have happened if you died first, and your wife was the one to survive in your absence? The elderly doctor realized his wife had been spared the suffering he had to endure, and was at peace once he found meaning for his sacrifice. Frankl clarifies that suffering is in no way necessary to find life's meaning. Rather, meaning is possible in spite of unavoidable suffering. When the suffering is inevitable, the relevant action to take is to remove its cause. To suffer unnecessarily is simply masochistic. Edith Weisskopf-Joelson, who was a professor of psychology at the University of Georgia before she died, contended that the current mental hygiene philosophy imposes happiness as a requirement, and that unhappiness is a sign of not fitting in. She stated that such a system might be counterproductive, that the burden of unavoidable suffering is escalated by the dissatisfaction from being unhappy. She expressed her hope that logotherapy might fix unhealthy trends in modern America, where a sufferer is given little opportunity to find nobility in his suffering, and thus becomes ashamed of being unhappy. Frankl then points out that accepting the challenge to suffer bravely provides meaning to it. Metaclinical problems. Psychiatrists nowadays are consulted by patients who would have gone to their pastor, rabbi, or priest in the former days to ask their doctor, "What is the meaning of my life?" A logodrama. Frankl shares his experience in attending a psychodrama. One woman told the story of how she lost one of her 2 boys and attempted to commit suicide. It had been her older son who was crippled, who had stopped her from taking her own life. Frankl responded by making her imagine that she wasn't 30, but 80 years old, in her deathbed looking back on her life. The woman then realized that she had dedicated her existence to making a fuller life possible for her eldest son, who without her would have been sent to an institution. In contrast was another woman, who had achieved financial and social success. She had lived in luxury, flirted with men, and had an easy life. When she looked back, however, she realized that her 80 years of existence had no meaning. Thus, Frankl made it become clear that the duration of one's life does not define its value. The 30-year-old woman had lived a fuller life than the 80-year-old lady. He then proceeded to another inquiry. Will an ape, which was punctured again and again, ever comprehend the meaning of its suffering? The group responded by saying that with the ape's limited intelligence, it would not. However, Frankl challenged this in terms of mankind, presenting the possibility that human beings may still not be the terminal point in the evolution of the universe. He asks, is it not possible that there is a world beyond the world of man, in which the meaning of human suffering is revealed? The super meaning. According to logotherapy, man should not have to endure the lack of meaning in life. Rather, he needs to accept his incapacity to rationally understand its unconditional meaningfulness, considering that logos extends beyond logic. This points to the super meaning, the context in which the ultimate meaning surpasses the intellectual capacity of man. This can be seen in the context of man's spiritual resources. When a patient draws from his firm religious belief, its therapeutic effect proves to be useful. Frankl discovers this from an encounter he had with a Jewish rabbi who had lost his entire family in Auschwitz. He seemed to be inconsolable, until Frankl told him the meaning of his suffering could be his purification, so that he'd be worthy to join his family in heaven. This new point of view gave him relief. Life's transitoriness. Frankl reiterates that life's transitory aspects are potentialities, which, when actualized, are transformed into realities. Thus, life's transitoriness does not make it meaningless. Rather, it solidifies man's responsibleness, because everything revolves around his realization of the transitory. In turn, logotherapy becomes activistic. Frankl expounds on this through an example. A pessimistic man looks at the days passed on his calendar with sadness as the pages grow thinner, but the activistic man files the pages and jots down a few notes of reflection. Logotherapy as a technique. Logotherapy has developed techniques to address both realistic and neurotic fear, and Frankl presents these techniques by first introducing anticipatory anxiety. This is the type of fear that produces exactly what the patient is afraid of. In the same way, a forced intention makes it impossible for the patient to get what he wishes. This is what Frankl calls hyperintention. For instance, in sexual neurosis, the more a man tries to demonstrate sexual potency, the more he fails to do so, as pleasure must remain as a byproduct. In addition, there is also hyperreflection, or excessive attention. For example, a woman who had been sexually abused by her father in childhood is troubled by her frigidness. Her anticipatory anxiety led her to give excessive attention towards her own sexual pleasure. Nevertheless, when her attention was redirected towards the correct subject, namely her partner, orgasm occurred spontaneously. Logotherapy bases its technique, paradoxical intention, on two facts. One, that a man's fear brings about what he is afraid of, and two, that hyperintention makes it impossible to get what he wishes. The technique encourages the patient to invite that which he fears, if only for a moment. This way, the fear is replaced by a paradoxical wish, making use of self-detachment within a sense of humor. For example, one patient suffered from an excessive fear of perspiring for 4 years, which worsened with his anticipatory anxiety. Frankl advised him to deliberately demonstrate to people just how much he could sweat. After a week, he was completely free from the phobia. He was able to distance himself from his neurosis. Paradoxical intention can also be applied to obsessive-compulsive and sleep disturbance conditions. The collective neurosis. Every age has a unique collective neurosis and a psychotherapy to match it. Today's mass neurosis is nihilism, the contention that being is devoid of meaning. The psychotherapy intended to address it must be free from the influence of nihilistic philosophy, otherwise it's bound to foster neurotic fatalism. It must be established that man is free to take a stand against the conditions he faces. Critique of Panddeterminism. Frankl coined the term Panddeterminism as the perspective of man that disregards his ability to take a stand toward any condition. To him, this is a dangerous assumption, as man does not simply exist, but decides what his existence will be. Thus, every man has the freedom to change at any moment. However, freedom is at risk of becoming mere arbitrariness unless it is exercised in terms of responsibleness. The Psychiatric Credo. Even when suffering incurable psychosis, man's innermost person and dignity remain intact. This is Frankl's Psychiatric Credo. The troubled person is not merely a damaged brain machine, otherwise euthanasia won't be an issue. To Frankl, a patient is more than that. Psychiatry rehumanized. For half a century, psychiatry interpreted the human mind as merely a machine. Consequently, therapy was reduced to mere technique. Frankl believed it was time to establish a humanized psychiatry. This generation has come to know man as he truly is, that he is self-determining, and the actualization of his potentialities depends not on conditions, but decisions. The case for a tragic optimism. In logotherapy, the tragic triad is composed of pain, guilt, and death. Thus, a tragic optimism means that one remains optimistic amidst the tragic triad. In this chapter, based on a lecture at the Third World Congress of Logotherapy, West Germany, 1983, Frankl poses the question of how it is possible to continue on living in spite of these tragedies and responds to it with 1. Transforming suffering into accomplishment. 2. Deriving opportunity to better oneself from guilt. And 3. responding to the transitoriness of life with responsible action. He emphasizes that optimism cannot be commanded, in the same way that happiness, love, or faith cannot be pursued. Man is not so much in pursuit of happiness as he is in pursuit of a reason to be happy. Once he is successful in finding meaning to life, he becomes happy as well as enabled to cope with suffering. Even scholars outside of logotherapy found that the feeling of meaninglessness is a fundamental cause of neurosis. Frankl points out that it was when he had successfully persuaded his patients to participate in meaningful activity that their depression disappeared. Although the feeling of meaninglessness is not a matter of pathology, it may cause a pathological reaction. The existential vacuum, for instance, can lead to depression, anxiety, addiction, and in some cases, suicide. In logotherapy, the perception of meaning is completely down to earth. It is defined by an awareness of what can be done in any given situation. As previously stated, there are three main ways of arriving at life's meaning. 1. The creation of works or deeds. 2. Encountering something or someone. And 3. Turning tragedy into triumph. Frankl emphasizes the third avenue as having the most importance. In his discussion of guilt, Frankl states that a crime remains inexplicable, as any effort to explain one's crime would mean removing his guilt and responsibility for it. On death, he reiterates that the irreversibility of life highlights the importance of maximizing the opportunities to act properly. Sigmund Freud asserted that, with the increase of an imperative urge among a diversity of people, comes the blurring of individual differences. Frankl contradicts this by providing his experiences in the camps as an example. There he observed that, contrary to Freud's imposition, the prisoners had unmasked themselves, and each of their differences had become more apparent. William J. Winslade, philosopher, lawyer, and psychoanalyst, traces Frankl's beginnings as a student, influenced by Freud, until his success in establishing logotherapy as a psychiatric technique. He emphasizes Frankl's wisdom, which dictates that a positive attitude towards life's challenges enables him to endure suffering while enhancing happiness. Winslade recognizes that the significance of man's search for meaning lies in the fact that it does not command people what to do. Rather, it tells them why they must do it. Rather, it tells them why they must do it. Frankl's work has inspired many therapists to take a different approach towards their patients, in terms of helping them choose productive futures. His influence has made therapy less abstract and more humanistic.